The story begins not with triumph, but with silence. A silence so heavy, it seemed to crush the air above Ouagadougou, where whispers of betrayal carried farther than the sound of gunfire. On a night without stars, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office, staring at a document placed before him by unseen hands. It bore the seal of the International Monetary Fund, stamped with words that carried the weight of centuries of exploitation. The demand was simple, brutal, and cruel. Burkina Faso was to surrender 60% of its newly discovered gold reserves, not for trade, not for investment, but for debt repayment. Debts born long before Traoré had ever dreamed of leading his nation. If he refused, his country would be starved. Fuel shipments cut. Grain silos locked. The fragile hope of survival for millions would vanish overnight. And, as if foreign chains were not enough, within his own barracks, 3 powerful generals sharpened their knives in the shadows. They had grown fat under foreign contracts, their loyalty not to Burkina Faso, but to the invisible hand of power that fed them. To them, Traoré was a boy, too young, too defiant, too unyielding to bend to the old order. And so, as the IMF's ultimatum fell upon his desk, another ultimatum grew in silence. Either Ibrahim would yield to their control, or he would not leave the presidency alive. For a man carrying the memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who dared to dream of an Africa free and self-sufficient, the weight was unbearable. The ghosts of betrayal hung thick in the air. Sankara had fallen not by foreign bullets alone, but by the betrayal of his own brother in arms, and now history threatened to repeat itself. The young captain turned president closed his eyes and heard the cries of his people. In the northern villages, mothers buried children whose stomachs had caved in from hunger. In the mining fields, men dug with bloodied hands, only to see gold carted away to foreign banks. In the capital, ordinary families lived by candlelight, powerless to afford the rising price of fuel. And yet, above their suffering, the generals laughed in private chambers, sipping imported wine, their pockets swelling with bribes from foreign companies waiting like vultures for Burkina's riches. The stage was set. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center of an impossible choice. To submit would be to betray his people, but to resist meant war not only against the IMF and its Western backers, but against his own blood, his generals. And so, the countdown began. 93 minutes, the time it would take for Traoré to confront the 3 men who had once pledged loyalty and now plotted his downfall. What he did next shocked the world. But before that confrontation, the world needed to understand who Ibrahim Traoré was and why he had become the lightning rod of Africa's struggle for dignity. Ibrahim was not born with power in his hands. He was born in the red dust of Burkina Faso, where survival itself was a form of defiance. From childhood, he had seen the naked cruelty of poverty, where children fetched water from wells poisoned with dust, where farmers prayed for rain that never came, and where mothers tightened belts around their waists so their children could eat first. But there was something unyielding in his spirit. He studied. He fought. He served in the military not to enrich himself, but to shield his people from a world that preyed upon the weak. When others sought promotions, he sought principles. When others pocketed foreign bribes, he remembered Sankara's words. He who feeds you controls you. By 2022, Burkina Faso was collapsing. Islamist insurgents burned villages in the north, foreign corporations extracted wealth unchecked, and a corrupt regime bowed to Western interests while its people starved. Out of this chaos rose Traoré, not because he sought power, but because power collapsed all around him, and someone had to stand where others had fallen. He was only in his 30s when he took the presidency by force of will and military courage. The world scoffed. Commentators in Paris, Washington, and London dismissed him as another African officer grasping for power. But to the people of Burkina Faso, he was something more. He was Sankara's echo, the dream reborn. Yet dreams, in Africa, come at a cost. The weight of Sankara's ghost no leader in Burkina Faso could rise without the shadow of Thomas Sankara. Sankara had dared to reject the IMF, dared to rename the nation Burkina Faso, the land of upright men. He had banned foreign luxury cars for ministers, encouraged women to lead, and planted millions of trees to fight desertification. He had told Africa to stand tall. For this, he was betrayed. Gunned down in 1987, his revolution strangled before it could grow. His killers, not only foreign powers, but men who had once called him brother. Now, nearly 4 decades later, Ibrahim Traore carried Sankara's torch. Every speech he gave echoed Sankara's defiance. Every policy he tried to implement, freeing Burkina from French military dependence, reclaiming mines from foreign companies, carried Sankara's spirit, and with that spirit came the curse. Betrayal was inevitable. The IMF's letter was no accident. It was the same trap Sankara had refused. The general's plotting was no accident. It was the same dagger Sankara had felt in his back. The past was not history. It was happening again. The 3 generals who circled Traoré were not faceless men. Each represented a piece of the old system. General Saw, a man with deep ties to French contractors, whose wealth came not from loyalty to Burkina, but from selling military contracts to the highest bidder. General Caboret, ruthless and ambitious, who saw in Traoré's youth a weakness, to be exploited, believing no young officer could hold the state together. General Zida, once a respected soldier, now a shadow agent of foreign influence, his silence masking the weight of secrets traded for favors. Together, they whispered, in the barracks, lobbied foreign diplomats in hidden rooms, and waited for the moment to strike. They were not merely soldiers. They were merchants of betrayal. And Traoré knew it. The people, meanwhile, bore the heaviest burden. Food prices soared as sanctions cut trade routes. Farmers abandoned fields plagued by insurgents. Children fainted in classrooms from hunger. The markets of Ouagadougou were filled not with abundance, but with empty stalls. To the outside world, these were statistics. To Ibrahim Traoré, they were faces. He had walked through villages where families offered him nothing but water because they had no food to give. He had carried the coffin of a soldier killed not by enemy fire, but by lack of equipment withheld by corrupt officers. He had watched mothers plead for medicine that never arrived. Every cry became a weight on his shoulders, and yet his enemies whispered that he was too inexperienced, too young, too idealistic to bear the burden. But history had a cruel sense of timing. For within days of the IMF's demand, within hours of famine spreading in the north, within minutes of the generals sharpening their knives, Traoré would be forced into a confrontation that would define not only his destiny, but the destiny of Africa. 93 minutes, that was all it would take. The boy who carried Sankara's dream would now stand in the furnace of betrayal, and the world would see whether he would burn, or whether he would rise in fire. The morning sun rose blood-red over Ouagadougou. But, for the people of Burkina Faso, its warmth carried no comfort. The markets were bare. Grain sacks had doubled in price overnight. At the edge of the capital, queues for water stretched for hours, mothers clutching empty jerrycans as their children cried from thirst. In the northern provinces, entire villages were burned to the ground by insurgents emboldened by the state's instability. Survivors wandered barefoot across the desert, their faces hollow, their voices broken. They carried no possessions, only memories of homes reduced to ash. And in the gilded halls of power, far from the cries of the people, 3 generals plotted. In a smoke-filled chamber, the generals sat in silence as a foreign diplomat placed a briefcase on the table. The man's suit was crisp, his accent French, his smile sharp. "This," he said, opening the case to reveal stacks of dollars, "is only the beginning. All that is required is for you to correct the boy's mistakes." "He is too dangerous!" General Saw leaned forward, greed shining in his eyes. "He refuses every proposal. He speaks of Sankara, of sovereignty, of dignity. Dignity does not feed a nation." General Zida's voice was colder. "And if he does not bend, he will break us all. The IMF waits for his signature. Without it, sanctions will strangle us. If Burkina Faso collapses, so will we." General Caboret slammed his fist against the table. "Then it is decided. The boy must yield, or he must disappear." Their pact was sealed not with words of loyalty, but with silence, a silence more dangerous than bullets. In the palace, Traoré read the IMF's ultimatum again. His advisors begged him to reconsider. "Mr. President," one minister whispered, "we cannot fight the West. We have no reserves. Our people are starving already. If you resist, the embargo will crush us. Sign the agreement. Let us survive today. Perhaps tomorrow will be better." Traoré slammed the paper onto the desk. "Survive as slaves, with our gold stolen, with our future sold. And when tomorrow comes, what then? More debt, more chains, more begging bowls. at the feet of those who made us hungry. He turned his gaze toward the window, where the streets outside were filling with protesters. They carried signs not of hate, but of desperation. Food, water, dignity. Traoré's voice broke. They did not elect me to be a coward. They trusted me to defend them, even if it costs me everything. That night, he walked through the city without guards. Cloaked in silence, he moved among his people. In the marketplace, he found a mother with 3 children, huddled beneath a broken stall. "Have you eaten?" Traoré asked softly. The woman shook her head. "We had 1 bowl of rice yesterday. Tonight, we have nothing, but God will provide." One of the children tugged at Ibrahim's hand. "Are you the soldier who fights for us?" Traoré knelt, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, and I promise you I will not stop." The child smiled weakly, unaware that the man before him carried the weight of life and death for millions. As Traoré rose and walked away, his fists trembled. The suffering of his people was not an accident. It was engineered. By sanctions, by theft, by betrayal. He swore to himself then, "If they want my surrender, they will have to kill me first." While the people cried, the generals moved swiftly. They ordered loyal officers to divert military supplies meant for the north, leaving soldiers to fight insurgents with empty magazines. They spread rumors in the barracks, whispering that Traoré was too young, too reckless, too radical. They prepared letters of resignation for ministers to isolate him when the moment came. And then came the most dangerous betrayal of all. A midnight phone call, a voice on the line, cold and precise. "Captain Traoré, your enemies move faster than you think. By dawn, they will force you into submission. They have promised your head for gold. Trust no one." The line went dead. Traoré stared into the darkness. He had suspected betrayal, but now the storm was no longer distant. It was at his door. Across Africa, whispers spread. Some hailed Traoré as the continent's last hope against neocolonialism. Others dismissed him as a reckless dreamer doomed to Sankara's fate. In Paris, officials plotted sanctions. In Washington, policymakers drafted reports on stability concerns. And in Ouagadougou, the people waited. Some with hope, some with fear, all with desperation. The clock ticked toward the inevitable. 93 minutes, that was all it would take. 93 minutes to decide whether Ibrahim Traoré would become another martyr or the man who broke Africa's chains. Act 3. The 93-minute showdown. The air inside the palace was suffocating. It was not the heat. It was the weight of betrayal pressing in on every wall, every corridor. Outside, thunder cracked over Ouagadougou, as if the heavens themselves knew that history was about to pivot. At 7 p.m., the doors of the War Council chamber closed. 3 generals walked in, uniforms stiff with medals, their eyes burning with calculation. Behind them, shadowy figures, foreign envoys, IMF representatives, men in expensive suits who smelled of cologne and corruption. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the head of the long oak table, alone. The countdown had begun. 93 minutes. Minute 110. The ultimatum General Zida spoke first, his voice dripping with disdain. "Young captain, the time for childish speeches is over. The IMF awaits your signature. You will sign. Tonight." General Saw leaned forward. "Refuse, and the embargo deepens. Your people will starve. Your soldiers will desert. You will fall. And Africa will forget you." The diplomat slid a pen across the table. "Do the reasonable thing. Sign and live." Traoré's hand hovered above the document. His heart thundered, not with fear, but with fury. Behind his eyes, he saw the starving children in the market, the villages burning in the north, the mother who had whispered, "God will provide." He pushed the pen back. "I will not sign away my people's soul." The room froze. Minute 11 to 30. The general's strike, General Cabaret slammed his fist. "Enough. You speak of soul while our people die. You are not Sankara. You are a boy playing at revolution. You think you can fight the West? They will crush you like an ant." The foreign envoy smirked. "History is full of martyrs, Captain. Dead men with ideals. Is that what you want to be?" The generals rose from their seats, circling Traoré like vultures. Their voices dripped with venom. You are weak. You are naive. You will not live to see morning. But Traoré did not flinch. His silence cut sharper than any blade. He knew this was no negotiation. This was an execution staged in slow motion. Minute 31:60, the trap tightens, the palace lights flickered. Outside, armored trucks rumbled into position. Soldiers loyal to the generals encircled the compound. One of Traoré's guards whispered, "Sir, we are surrounded." Traoré did not move. Let them come. Tonight decides everything. Inside the chamber, the pressure mounted. The IMF envoy produced another folder. Here is the list of assets we will seize. Your mines, your reserves, your land. Without cooperation, Burkina Faso will cease to exist. Traoré's fists clenched. He spoke at last, his voice trembling with controlled rage. You steal our gold. You starve our people, you burn our villages, and then you tell us it is survival. No, it is slavery. And tonight, slavery ends. The generals laughed, but beneath their laughter was unease. The boy was not bending. The boy was not breaking. Minute 61:80. The defiance. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows. Rain pounded against the palace, as if Africa itself was beating on the walls. Traoré rose from his chair. His shadow loomed over the table. You think I am alone, but listen. He gestured toward the windows. Beyond the rain, a sound rose, a roar, faint but growing. Tens of thousands of voices in the streets, chanting his name. Traoré! 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 The generals froze. They had underestimated the boy. He leaned across the table. I do not command with fear. I command with faith. My people are my shield. My people are my weapon, and they will bury you. The diplomat's smile faltered. For the first time, fear cracked through the arrogance. Minute 81:93. The blow. The clock neared its final minutes. Guns cocked outside. The door trembled with the weight of soldiers preparing to storm. General Zida spat. This ends now. But before he could finish, the chamber doors burst open. A flood of young officers stormed in, not for the generals, but for Traoré. They saluted him, rifles raised high. Captain, we stand with you. The generals' faces went pale. Their soldiers had defected. Their plot unraveled in an instant. Traoré's voice thundered across the chamber. You sought to sell my country. You sought to betray Africa. But tonight, Burkina Faso chooses freedom. He raised his hand. The soldiers moved. 93 minutes after the meeting began, the generals were no more. The palace fell silent, save for the echo of rain. The IMF envoy was dragged from the chamber, his briefcase abandoned on the floor. The people outside roared as word spread. The generals were finished. But as Traoré stood alone in the aftermath, drenched in sweat and stormlight, one thought burned in his mind. This was only the beginning. The rain did not stop that night. It poured over Ouagadougou as though the skies themselves were baptizing the nation in storm water. The palace, once filled with whispers of betrayal, now stood silent, except for the echo of boots and the distant cries of the people outside. Inside the chamber, the bodies of 3 generals lay still. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. For 93 minutes, time had been frozen in dread. Now it resumed its march, leaving only the aftermath of revolution. Traoré stood motionless at the table, his hands pressed against the oak, his breathing steady but heavy. His officers surrounded him, waiting for orders. Some were elated, others shaken. Victory, after all, is never clean. He looked at them, young faces, hardened by war, yet still carrying the fragility of youth. They had chosen him over their generals, but at a cost. He knew some would never sleep without nightmares again. The IMF envoy had been taken away, but his words lingered like poison. History is full of martyrs, Captain. Dead men with ideals. Was that what he had become? He whispered to himself, almost inaudible. Sankara, did I do enough? Or did I just place my head on the same altar? Outside the palace, the news spread like fire across the city. The chants grew louder, echoing through every street, every home, every village carried by radios and cell phones. The generals are gone. Traoré has defeated them. Burkina Faso is free. People poured into the streets despite the rain, dancing barefoot in the mud, lifting flags high into the storm. Mothers wept. Fathers embraced their children. Strangers became brothers and sisters in an instant. For the first time in decades, the people felt the impossible, not fear, not despair, but victory, and yet, beneath the joy was unease. The West would not remain silent. France, the IMF, the shadowed powers that bled Africa dry. They had been humiliated. Retaliation was inevitable. In Paris, in Washington, in London, the phones rang all night. Diplomats argued, generals cursed, economists panicked. Reports confirmed the impossible. 3 Burkinabe generals, loyal to Western contracts and IMF demands, had been executed by their own army, and the country rallied not against the coup, but in favor of the young captain who had defied it. It was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. "How long can this boy last?" asked one Western minister. "Long enough to inspire the rest of Africa," replied another, grim-faced. For the first time since Sankara's death, Africa had a leader who had faced the beast head-on and won. Across the continent, the shockwaves spread. In Mali, in Niger, in Ghana, in Congo, whispers filled the air. If Burkina Faso can rise, why not us? If Traoré can destroy his chains, why can't we? Young soldiers in barracks repeated his name in hushed tones. Villagers told stories of his defiance around fires at night. Intellectuals in universities debated if this was the dawn of a second wave of African liberation. Traoré had not just killed 3 generals, he had resurrected hope. But hope had enemies. The IMF, shamed before the world, demanded immediate sanctions. Burkina Faso's reserves were frozen overnight. Aid was suspended. Foreign companies began pulling out, leaving half-finished buildings. As monuments of abandonment, Traoré gathered his ministers. The room was grim. No funds, no imports, no contracts. They will strangle us. But the captain only nodded. Then we will plant. We will mine. We will fight with what we have. If they will not feed us, we will feed ourselves. If they will not trade with us, Africa will. The room was silent. He was not speaking as a captain anymore. He was speaking as a president. Yet victory carried its own wounds. Traoré spent nights awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of gunshots in his dreams. He saw the faces of the generals. Men who had once been his superiors. Men he had studied under. Betrayers, yes, but also men who had once guided him. He had destroyed them in 93 minutes. But the boy within him wondered, had he also destroyed a piece of himself? Sometimes he walked alone through the streets, at night, disguised, listening to the people. He heard their laughter, their newfound hope, but also their fears. Would this victory last? Or was it just a spark in the storm? Months passed. The sanctions bit hard, but Burkina Faso endured. The fields filled again. Volunteers rebuilt schools. Soldiers stood taller, no longer mercenaries of foreign interest, but defenders of their soil. And everywhere, one name rose, Traoré. He was no longer just the captain. He was the man who had defied the IMF, broken the generals, and given Africa a mirror of its own strength. Some called him reckless. Others called him blessed. But to millions, he had become something greater, a symbol. Western media scrambled to paint him as a tyrant, a dictator, a dangerous radical. But the images told another story. A young man walking through markets without guards, children running to him, women lifting his hand to their foreheads in blessing. For every headline that smeared him, 1,000 voices rose in defiance. He is ours, he is Africa's, and so the question spread. From dusty villages to gleaming cities, whispered in classrooms, shouted in protests, prayed in churches and mosques. If Traoré can rise, why not us? On the anniversary of that night, Traoré stood before the people. The rain returned, as if history itself remembered. He raised the flag of Burkina Faso high, the colors glowing against the storm. 3 generals fell in 93 minutes, but Africa has stood for centuries. And tonight, Africa will stand again. The people roared, the ground shook, the storm broke, and in that moment, The world saw not just a soldier, not just a leader, but a nation reborn. Closing rhetorical question. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains? The rains had ended. The streets of Ouagadougou, still muddy with the memory of revolt, began to dry beneath the merciless Sahel sun. Yet in that mud, something had been planted, not just hope, but defiance. Traoré walked the corridors of Niamey, power with the weight of a nation on his shoulders. But now, he carried more than Burkina Faso. Across the continent, his name had become a spark, whispered in villages, debated in parliaments, feared in boardrooms. In Bamako, soldiers painted his face on walls beside the word liberation. In Accra, students marched with placards, "We are all Traoré." In Kinshasa, musicians wove his name into songs of resistance. And in capitals of the West, there was unease. For decades, Africa had been spoken of as a resource, a market, a problem. Now, Africa was speaking back, but liberation carried its price. Sanctions tightened, fuel grew scarce, medicines vanished from shelves. In hospitals, mothers wept as children went untreated. Farmers struggled to sell crops when borders closed. The IMF thought hunger would break the people's spirit, but instead it hardened them. One old woman, her back bent by age, stood in a market line and told a journalist, "We have eaten less before, but we have never eaten free. I will starve before I kneel again." That spirit spread like fire. By the year's end, delegations from Mali, Niger, Guinea and beyond arrived in Ouagadougou, not with contracts from Paris or Washington, but with open hands. They spoke of cooperation, of African markets for African goods, of security shared by Africans alone. In dusty conference rooms, men and women drafted what no colonial power had ever wanted to see: an African economic pact free from Western chains. And at the center of it all sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who had shattered 3 generals in 93 minutes. But enemies do not forgive humiliation. Mercenaries plotted in the shadows. Foreign agents spread whispers of coup attempts. Radio waves carried propaganda calling him a dictator. At night, Traoré would sit alone, knowing assassins could come for him at any moment. Yet he did not retreat behind walls. He still walked the streets, still ate among his people, still lifted children into his arms. For every bullet aimed at him, 1,000 hands rose to shield him. The transformation of a symbol. He had begun as a soldier, reluctant and raw, thrust into history's fire. He had emerged a leader, scarred but unbroken. Now, he was something else. His image appeared in murals from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. His speeches were broadcast in secret across nations, still under foreign grip. His story, the 93 minutes that changed Africa, became a legend, and legends, once born, cannot be killed. The final reflection. One evening, on the balcony of the presidential residence, Traoré stood alone as the sun set over the city. He thought of Sankara, of the generals, of the IMF envoys' mocking words. He thought of the children dancing in the rain that night of victory. He whispered, not to his people, not to his ministers, but to himself. Maybe we are not free yet, but today, Africa believes it can be. And in that whisper lay the seed of a revolution that would echo for generations. The world had tried to break him in 93 minutes. Instead, he had given the world 93 minutes that would never be forgotten. Is this the beginning of Africa's rebirth, or the battle before the true storm?